Hello! Coming to you from the library. I wanted to recap Chapter 6 and then begin Chapter 7. Chapter 7 is long, so we will probably divide it into two parts. Chapter 6, we learn who Gatsby really is. We learn that his legal name was J. Gatz, and he was originally from North Dakota. He left North Dakota. He took various jobs. He was a fisherman, fished for clams, oysters, stuff like that. He made up himself. He kind of rebirthed himself. He was able to come up with a dream of who he wanted to be, and he ultimately did that. So we know that at 17, this is who he really wanted to be, and that's who he is. He came into the association of Dan Cody, and Dan Cody had lots of money. He owned a yacht. One day it was about to storm really badly, so Gatsby got into a little boat and rushed out to the yacht and informed Dan Cody of this. Afterwards, Cody took him on and they sailed around the world together, and Gatsby knew that this is the life that he wanted. He also took care of Cody because oftentimes he drank too much. We did learn that Dan Cody had kind of like a mistress, a lover. They got together, broke up many times. We know that she came upon his yacht, and a few days later he died. In the will, Cody left Gatsby $25,000, which today is a lot of money, but back then it was probably worth, about $1 million, which is huge. However, she made sure that he did not get it. All right, so that's kind of the recap of 6. A few things I want to talk about as the chapter progressed. Daisy and Tom and Nick all went to Gatsby's party, and just Daisy didn't like it. And here we really see the issue of social class defined. Gatsby is incredibly sensitive to it because from what he didn't have to what he has now. And he realizes that he needs to continue to put on that face. He's very aware of himself. He has, in a way, cast himself into a higher caste system. I think the thing he finds most about Daisy and how alluring she is how just wealth comes effortlessly to her. Gatsby's power to make his dreams a reality, to make his dreams come true, is what makes him great, and that is why the book is called The Great Gatsby. The most powerful dream is his own identity and who he has made himself become, so his idea of self. Gatsby continues to live in that dream. He sees Daisy as that still sweet girl from Louisville. We know that's not the case. We know that she would never desert her own social class. However, Gatsby's still kind of delusional about that. We also see the social class defined when Tom Buchanan and the Sloanes happen to end up at Gatsby's house, and they're all kind of repulsed about how grand and how ostentatious it is. Gatsby has a lot of money. We all know this. However, he lacks that sense of social knowledge, that social nuance that only one has that comes from East Edgewood. No, they didn't want him to come to dinner, and he did not pick up on it. So even, guys, I think the thing I really want you to take from this is even among the very, 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 very rich, there are still class distinctions, and we see this in this chapter. Something else that I'm sure you're thinking about right now is we know that Daisy and Gatsby have been having an affair. However, Fitzgerald never really demonstrates this because, remember, this is still Nick's story. All right, so I know that was long, but I felt like you need to know it. Chapter 7. Chapter 7 is pivotal. It's kind of the climax, really, of the whole book. So we are going to take some time going through this. Okay, so I am on page 1:13. Okay? All right, here we go. It was when curiosity about Gatsby was at its highest that the lights in his house failed to go on one Saturday night, and as obscurely as it had begun, his career as a Tremelco was over. Only gradually did I become aware of that the automobiles, which turned expectantly into his driveway, stayed for just a minute and then drove sulkily away. Wondering if he were sick, I went over to find out, and an unfamiliar butler, with a villainous face, squinted at me suspiciously from the door. Okay, so why do you think the lights went out? What was the only reason Gatsby was having all these parties to begin with? It was in hopes that Daisy would show up. And now he no longer feels the need to have these parties. Is Mr. Gatsby sick? Nope. After a pause, he added sir in a dilatory, grudging way. I hadn't seen him around, and I was rather worried. Tell him Mr. Carroway came over. Who? He demanded rudely. Carroway. Carroway. All right, I'll tell him. Abruptly, he slammed the door. My Finn informed me that Gatsby had dismissed every servant in his house a week ago and replaced them with half a dozen others who never went into West Egg Village to be bribed by the tradesmen, but ordered moderate supplies over the telephone. The grocery boy reported that the kitchen looked like a pigsty, and the general opinion in the village was that these people weren't servants at all. Next day, Gatsby called me on the phone. Going away? I inquired. No, old sport. I hear you fired all your servants. I wanted somebody who wouldn't gossip. Daisy comes over quite often in the afternoon. So the whole caravanserai had fallen in like a card house at the disapproval in her eyes. There's some people Wolfsham wanted to do something for. They're all brothers and sisters. They used to run a small hotel. Okay, so these are all Wolfsham's men. We know that they are not good people, that they are all involved in gambling and bootlegging. I see. He was calling up at Daisy's request. Would I come to lunch at her house tomorrow? Miss Baker would be there. Half an hour later, Daisy herself telephoned, and seemed relieved to find that I was coming. Something was up. And yet I couldn't believe that they would choose this occasion for a scene, especially for the rather harrowing scene that Gatsby had outlined in the garden. Okay, so Nick's terrified that they are going to confront Tom, that they are having an affair, and that Daisy's going to leave her husband for Gatsby, and lo and behold, Jordan and Nick are in the middle of it. Uncomfortable. The next day was broiling. Almost the last, certainly the warmest of the summer. As my train emerged from the tunnel into a sunlight, only the hot whistles of the National Biscuit Company broke the simmering hush at noon. The straw seats of the car hovered on the edge of combustion. The woman next to me perspired delicately for a while into her white shirtwaist, and then, as her newspaper dampened under her fingers, lapsed despairingly into the heat, with a desolate cry. Her pocketbook slapped to the floor. Okay, pay attention to how many times either heat or hot is mentioned. What happens to our emotions when it's hot? Oh my, she gasped. I picked it up with a weary bend and handed it back to her, holding it at arm's length and by the extreme tip of the corners to indicate that I had no designs upon it. But everyone near me, including the woman, suspected me just the same. Hot, said the conductor to familiar faces. Some weather. Hot, hot, hot. Is it hot enough for you? Is it hot? Is it... My communication ticket came back to me with a dark stain from his hand. That anyone should care in this heat, whose flushed lips he kissed, whose head made damp the pajama pocket over his heart. Through the hall of the Buchanan's house blew a faint wind, carrying the sound of the telephone bell out to Gatsby and me as he waited at the door. The master's body, roared the butler into the mouthpiece. I'm sorry, madam, but we can't furnish it. It's far too hot to touch this afternoon. What he really said was, yes, I'll see. He set down the receiver, came toward us, glistening slightly to take our stiff straw hats. Madam expects you in the salon, he cried needlessly, indicating the direction. In this heat, every extra gesture was an affront to the common store of life. The room was shadowed well with awnings, was dark and cool. Daisy and Jordan lay upon an enormous couch like silver idols, weighted down their own white dresses against the singing breeze of the fans. "We can't move," they said together. Jordan's fingers, powdered white over their tan, rested for a moment in mine. "And Mr. Thomas Buchanan, the athlete?" I inquired. Simultaneously, I heard his voice, gruff, muffled, husky, at the hall telephone. Gatsby stood in the center of the crimson carpet and gazed around with fascinated eyes. Daisy watched him and laughed. Her sweet, exciting laugh. A tiny gust of powder rose from her bosom in the air. "The rumor is," whispered Jordan, that's Tom's girl on the telephone." We were silent. The voice in the hall rose high with annoyance. "Very well, then. I won't sell you the car at all. I'm under no obligation to you at all. And as for your bothering me about it at lunchtime, I won't stand it at all." Holding down the receiver, said Daisy cynically. "No, he's not," I assured her. "It's a bona fide deal. I happen to know about it." Tom flung open the door, blocked out his space for a moment with his thick body, and hurried into the room. "Mr. Gatsby!" He put out his broad, flat hand with well-concealed dislike. "I'm glad to see you, sir. Nick?" "Make us a cold drink," cried Daisy. As he left the room again, she got up and went over to Gatsby and pulled his face down, kissing him on the mouth. "You know I love you," she murmured. "You forget there's a lady present," said Jordan. Daisy looked around doubtfully. "You kiss Nick, too. What a low, vulgar girl." "I don't care," cried Daisy, and began to clog on the brick fireplace. Then she remembered the heat and sat down guiltily on the couch, just as a freshly laundered nurse leading a little girl came to the room. "Blessed precious," she crooned, holding out her arms. "Come to your own mother who loves you." The child, relinquished by the nurse, rushed across the room and rooted shyly into her mother's dress. "The blessed precious! Did mother get powder on your old yellow hair? Stand up now and say howdy do." Gatsby and I turned, leaned down, and took the small, reluctant hand. Afterward, he kept looking at the child with surprise. I don't think he ever really believed it existed before. Okay, so why didn't he think that? Gatsby is still stuck where? Gatsby is still stuck in the past. He's trying to make these 5 years as if they never existed, and well, there's proof it does. "I got dressed before luncheon," said the child, turning eagerly to Daisy. "That's because your mother wanted to show you off." Her face bent into the single wrinkle of the small white neck. "You dream! You absolute little dream!" "Yes," admitted the child calmly. "Aunt Jordan's got on a white dress, too." "How do you like your mother's friends?" Daisy turned her around so that she faced Gatsby. "Do you think they're pretty?" "Where's Daddy?" "She doesn't look like her father," explained Daisy. "She looks like me. She's got my hair and shape of the face." Daisy sat back upon the couch. The nurse took a step forward and held out her hand. "Come, Pammy. Goodbye, sweetheart." With a reluctant backward glance, the well-disciplined child held to her nurse's hand and was pulled out the door, just as Tom came back, preceding 4 gin rickeys that clicked full of ice. Okay, so this is about the extent that we get of Daisy's child. To me, it really doesn't show that she has much interest in her child. She doesn't really know her child. The children are kind of meant to be seen but not heard. Gatsby took up his drink. "They certainly look cool," he said with visible tension. We drank in long, greedy swallows. "I read somewhere that the sun's getting hotter every year," said Tom genially. "It seems that pretty soon the Earth's going to fall into the sun. Or wait a minute. It's just the opposite. The sun's getting colder every year." All right, so they talked about global warming back then, too. "Come outside," he suggested to Gatsby. "I'd like you to have a look at the place." I went out with them on the veranda. On the green sound, stagnant in the heat, one small sail crawled slowly toward the fresher sea. Gatsby's eyes followed it momentarily. He raised his hand and pointed across the bay. "I'm right across from you." "So you are." Our eyes lifted over the rose beds and the hot lawn and the weedy refuse of the dog days along shore. Slowly the white wings of the boat moved against the blue, cool limit of the sky. Ahead lay the scalloped ocean and the abounding blessed isles. "There's a sport for you," said Tom, nodding. I'd like to be out there with him for about an hour. We had luncheon in the dining room, darkened too against the heat, and drank down nervous gaiety with cold ale. What do we do with ourselves this afternoon? Cried Daisy. And the day after that, and the next 30 years? Don't be morbid, Jordan said. Life starts all over again when it gets crisp in the fall. But it's so hot, insisted Daisy on the verge of tears, and everything's so confused. Let's all go to town. Her voice struggled on through the heat, beating against its molding its senselessness into forms. I've heard of making a garage out of a stable, Tom was saying to Gatsby, but I'm the first man who ever made a stable out of a garage. Who wants to go to town? Demanded Daisy insistently. Gatsby's eyes floated toward her. Ah, she cried. Look at you. You look so cool. Their eyes met, and they stared at each other, alone in space. With an effort, she glanced down at the table. You always look so cool, she repeated. She had told him that she loved him, and Tom Buchanan saw it. He was astounded. His mouth opened a little, and he looked at Gatsby, and then back at Daisy, as if he had just recognized her as someone he knew a long time ago. All right, Tom got it. He got it from how Daisy and Gatsby look at each other. She had it how in her tone of voice what she said to Gatsby. She might as well have just said in front of everybody that she loves him. And Tom, who, it's so ironic because he's having this affair himself, and he's just floored by the fact that his wife would go running around on him. You resemble the advertisement of the man, she went on innocently. The advertisement of the man. All right, broke in Tom quickly. I'm perfectly willing to go to town. Come on. We're all going to town. All right, so Tom is PO'd. We all know that he is about to explode, and he is probably going to use this opportunity to confront Gatsby. He got up, his eyes still flashing between Gatsby and his wife. No one moved. Come on! His temper crackled a little. What's the matter anyhow? If we're going to town, let's start. His hand trembling with his effort at self-control, bore to his lips the last of his glass of ale. Daisy's voice got us to our feet and out to the blazing gravel drive. Are we just going to go like that? She objected. Like this? Are we going to let anyone smoke a cigarette first? Everybody's been smoking all through lunch. Oh, let's have fun, she begged him. It's too hot to fuss. He didn't answer. Have it your way, she said. Come on, Jordan. They went upstairs to get ready, while we three men stood there shuffling the hot pebbles with our feet. A silver curve of the moon hovered already in the western sky. Gatsby started to speak, changed his mind, but not before Tom wheeled and faced him expectantly. Have you got your stables here? Asked Gatsby with an effort. About a quarter of a mile down the road. Oh. A pause. I don't see the idea of going to town, broke out Tom savagely. Women get these notions in their heads. Shall we take anything to drink? Called Daisy from the upper window. I'll get some whiskey, answered Tom. He went inside. Gatsby turned to me rigidly. I can't say anything in this house, old sport. She's got an indiscreet voice, I remember. It's full of... I hesitated. Her voice is full of money, he said suddenly. That was it. I'd never understood before. It was full of money. That was the inexhaustible charm that rose and fell in it, the jingle of it, the cymbal song of it. High in a white palace, the king's daughter, the golden girl. Tom came out of the house, wrapped a quart bottle in a towel, followed by Daisy and Jordan wearing small, tight hats of metallic cloth and carrying light capes over their arms. Shall we all go in my car? Suggested Gatsby. He felt the hot green leather of his seat. I ought to have left it in the shade. It's a standard shift, demanded Tom. Yes. Will you take my coupe and let me drive your car to town? The suggestion was distasteful to Gatsby. I don't think there's much gas, he objected. Plenty of gas, said Tom boisterously. He looked at the gauge. And if it runs out, I can stop at the drugstore. You can buy anything at a drugstore nowadays. A pause followed this apparently pointless remark. Daisy looked at Tom frowning, and an indefinable expression at once definitely unfamiliar and vaguely recognizable, as if I had only heard it described in words passed over Gatsby's face. Come on, Daisy, said Tom, pressing her with his hand toward Gatsby's car. I'll take you in this circus wagon. Okay. So Tom has insisted on driving Gatsby's car, Gatsby's circus wagon, to town. And Gatsby is going to drive Tom's coupe, so Tom's car. Are you following me? Okay. He opened the door and she moved out from the circle of his arms. You take Nick and Jordan. We'll follow you in the coupe. Okay, so going in Gatsby's car. Tom Buchanan is driving Gatsby's car. Nick and Jordan are riding with him. And Tom's car, Daisy and Gatsby are driving together. This is important. Okay, remember this. She walked close to Gatsby, touching his coat with her hand. Jordan and Tom and I got into the front seat of Gatsby's car. Tom pushed the unfamiliar gears tentatively, and we shot off into the oppressive heat, leaving them out of sight behind. Did you see that? Demanded Tom. See what? He looked at me keenly, realizing that Jordan and I must have known all along. You think I'm pretty dumb, don't you? He suggested. Perhaps I am, but I have almost a second sight sometimes, and that tells me what to do. Maybe you don't believe that, but science... He paused. The immediate contingency overtook him. He pulled him back from the edge of the theoretical abyss. I've made a small investigation of this fellow. Okay, so Tom is talking about Gatsby. He's made an investigation. I could have gone deeper if I'd known. Okay, so Tom is fully understanding of the affair that Gatsby and Daisy are having. Do you mean you've been to a medium? Inquired Jordan humorously. A medium is a shrink. Okay. What? Confused, he started at us, and we laughed. A medium, not a shrink. A fortune teller. I'm sorry. About Gatsby. About Gatsby? No, I haven't. I said I've been making a small investigation of his past. And you found that he was an Oxford man? Said Jordan helpfully. An Oxford man? He was incredulous. Like hell he is. He wears a pink suit. Nevertheless, he's an Oxford man. Oxford, New Mexico, snorted Tom contemptuously. Or something like that. Listen, Tom, if you're such a snob, why did you invite him to lunch? Demanded Jordan crossly. Daisy invited him. She knew him before we were married. God knows where. We were all irritable now, with the fading ale, and aware of it as we drove for a while in silence. Then, as Dr. T.J. Ecclesburg's faded eyes came into sight down the road, I remembered Gatsby's caution about gasoline. Okay, remember we talked about in Chapter 2 how these eyes that look down upon everyone on this billboard could potentially symbolize the eyes of God, and they are all driving under the eyes of God right now, so hopefully they can all kind of be made aware of their sins. We've got enough to get us to town, said Tom. But there's a garage right here, objected Jordan. I don't want to get stalled in this baking heat. Tom threw on both brakes impatiently, and we slid to an abrupt, dusty stop under Wilson's sign. Okay, so they're at Wilson and Myrtle's garage. Remember, Tom is having an affair with Myrtle. After a moment, the proprietor emerged from the interior of his establishment and gazed hollow-eyed at the car. Let's have some gas, cried Tom roughly. What do you think we've stopped for, to admire the view? I'm sick, said Wilson without moving. Been sick all day. What's the matter? I'm all run down. Well, shall I help myself? Tom demanded. You sounded well enough on the phone. With an effort, Wilson left the shade in support of the doorway, and breathing hard unscrewed the cap of the tank. In the sunlight, his face was green. I didn't mean to interrupt your lunch, he said, but I need money pretty bad, and I was wondering what you were going to do with your old car. How do you like this one? Inquired Tom. I bought it last week. It's a nice yellow, said Wilson, as he strained at the handle. Like to buy it? Big chance. Wilson smiled faintly. No, but I could make some money on the other. What do you want the money for all of a sudden? I've been here too long. I want to get away. My wife and I want to go west. Your wife does? Explained Tom, startled. She's been talking about it for 10 years. He rested for a moment against the pump, shading his eyes. And now she's going whether she wants to or not. I'm going to get her away. The coupe flashed by us with a flurry of dust and the flash of a waving hand. Okay, so again, Gatsby and Daisy are in Tom's car, and they were behind, and now they whiffed by them and waved at them as they're going into town. What do I owe you? Demanded Tom harshly. I just got wised up on something funny the last 2 days, remarked Wilson. That's why I want to get away. That's why I was bothering you about the car. What do I owe you? $1.20. The relentless beating heat was beginning to confuse me, and I had a moment there before I realized that so far his suspicion hadn't alighted on Tom. He had discovered that Myrtle had some sort of life apart from him in another world, and the shock had made him physically ill. I stared at him and then at Tom, who had made a parallel discovery less than an hour before. Okay, so Nick is like, okay, so both Wilson and Tom have both made the connection that both of their wives are having an affair, but Wilson does not realize that Myrtle is having the affair with Tom. Comprende? Okay. I stared at him and then at Tom, who had made a parallel discovery less than an hour before, and it occurred to me that there was no difference between men, in intelligence or weight or race, so profound as the difference between the sick and the well. Wilson was so sick that he looked guilty, unforgivably guilty, as if he just got some poor girl with child. I'll let you have the car, said Tom. I'll send it over tomorrow afternoon. That locality was always vaguely disquieting, even in the broad glare of afternoon, and now I turned my head as though I had been warned of something behind. Over the ash heaps, the giant eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg kept their vigil, but I perceived after a moment that the other eyes were regarding us with peculiar intensity from less than 20 feet away. Okay, guess who's looking down on all this? In one of the windows over the garage, the curtains had been moving aside a little, and Myrtle Wilson was peering down at the car. So engrossed was she that she had no consciousness of being observed, and one emotion after another crept into her face like objects into a slowly developing picture. Her expression was curiously familiar. It was an expression I had often seen on women's faces, but on Myrtle Wilson's face it seemed purposeless and inexplicable, until I realized that her eyes wide with jealous terror were fixed not on Tom, but on Jordan Baker, whom she took to be his wife. There is no confusion like the confusion of a simple mind, and as we drove away, Tom was feeling the hot wisps of panic. Okay, so Tom has realized, that not only is his wife cheating on him, but he's going to lose his mistress. Okay, so imagine what is building up in Tom right now, and imagine what's going to happen when they're all together. His wife and his mistress, until an hour ago, secure and invalid, were slipping precipitously from his control. Okay, so Tom's losing control, and Tom is a man that is always in control, and he has to do something to get that control back. Instinct made him step on the accelerator with the double purpose of overtaking Daisy and leaving Wilson behind, and we sped along toward Astoria at 50 miles an hour until among the spidery girders of the elevated we came in sight of the easy-going blue coupe. Those big movies around 50th Street are cool, suggested Jordan. I love New York on summer afternoons when everyone's away. There's something very sensuous about it, overripe as if all sorts of funny fruits were going to fall into your hands. The word sensuous had the effect of further disquieting Tom, but before he could invest a protest, the coupe came to a stop, and Daisy signaled us to draw up alongside. "Where are we going?" she cried. "How about the movies?" "It's so hot," she complained. "You go. We'll ride around and meet you after." With an effort, her wit rose faintly. "We'll meet you on some corner. I'll be the man smoking 2 cigarettes. "We can't argue about it here," Tom said impatiently as the truck gave out a cruising whistle behind us. "You follow me to the south side of Central Park, in front of the plaza." Several times he turned his head and looked back for their car, and if the traffic delayed them, he slowed up, until they came into sight. I think he was afraid they would dart down the street and out of his life forever. Okay, so we are seeing a little insecurity coming from Tom. He is desperately worried about what is going to happen to his wife and his life. But they didn't. And we all took the less explicable step of engaging the parlor of a suite in the Plaza Hotel. Okay, so, they leave their house to go hang out in a parlor room at the Plaza Hotel. So they have a suite, and that is where everyone is going. The prolonged and tumultuous argument that ended by herding us into the room eludes me, though I have a sharp physical memory that in the course of it, my underwear kept climbing like a damp snake around my legs, and the intermittent beads of sweat raced cool across my back. The notion originated with Daisy's suggestion that we hire 5 bathrooms and take 5 cold baths, and then assumed more tangible form as a place to have a mint julep. Each of us said over and over that it was a crazy idea. We all talked at once to a baffled clerk, and thought or pretended to think that we were being very funny. The room was large and stifling. Okay, so they're in a very large room that is very hot. And though it was already 4 o'clock, opening the windows admitted only a gust of hot shrubbery from the park. Daisy went to the mirror and stood with her back to us, fixing her hair. "It's a well suite," whispered Jordan respectfully, and everyone laughed. "Open another window," commanded Daisy without turning around. "There aren't any more." "Well, we'd better telephone for an axe." "The thing to do is to forget about the heat," said Tom impatiently. "You make it 10 times worse by crabbing about it." He unrolled the bottle of whiskey from the towel and put it on the table. "Why not let her alone, old sport?" remarked Gatsby. "You're the one who wanted to come to town." There was a moment of silence. The telephone book slipped from its nail and splashed on the floor, whereupon Jordan whispered, "Excuse me," but this time no one laughed. All right, so here we go. Confrontation's about to happen. "I'll pick it up," I offered. "I've got it." Gatsby examined the parted string, muttered, in an interested way, and tossed the book into the chair. "That's a great expression of yours, isn't it?" said Tom sharply. "What is?" "All this old sport business. Where'd you pick that up?" "Now, see here, Tom," said Daisy, turning around from the mirror. "If you're going to make personal remarks, I won't stay here a minute. Call up and order some ice for the mint julep." As Tom took up the receiver, the compressed heat exploded into the sound, and we were listening to the portentous chords of Mendelssohn's Wedding March from the ballroom below. "Imagine marrying anybody in this heat," cried Jordan dismally. "Still, I was married in the middle of June," Daisy remarked. "Louisville in June. Somebody fainted." "Who was it that fainted, Tom?" "Biloxi," he answered shortly. "A man named Biloxi. Blocks Biloxi. And he made faces, that's a fact. And he was from Biloxi, Mississippi." "They carried him to my house," appended Jordan, "because we lived just 2 doors from the church. And he stayed there 3 weeks until Daddy told him he had to get out. The day after he left, Daddy died." After a moment she added, as if she might have sounded irreverent, "There wasn't any connection." "I used to know a Bill Biloxi from Memphis," I remarked. "That was his cousin. I knew his whole family history before he left. He gave me the aluminum putter that I use today." The music had died down as the ceremony began, and now a long cheer floated in at the window, followed by the intimate cries of "Yeah!" and finally by a burst of jazz as the dancing began. "We're getting old," said Daisy. "If we were young, we'd rise and dance." "Remember Biloxi?" Jordan warned her. "Where'd you know him, Tom?" "Biloxi?" He concentrated with an effort. "I didn't know him. He was Daisy's friend." "He was not," she denied. "I'd never seen him before. He came down in a private car." "Well, he knew you. He said he was raised in Louisville. Asa Bird brought him around in the last minute and asked if we had room for him." Jordan smiled. "He was probably bumming his way home. He told me he was president of your class at Yale." Tom and I looked at each other blankly. "Biloxi?" "First place, we didn't have any president." Gatsby's foot beat a short, restless tattoo, and Tom eyed him suddenly. "By the way, Mr. Gatsby, I understand you're an Oxford man." "Not exactly." "Oh, yes, I understand you went to Oxford." "Yes, I went there." A pause. Then Tom's voice, incredulous and insulting. You must have gone there about the time Biloxi went to New Haven. Another pause. A waiter knocked and came in with crushed mint and ice, but the silence was unbroken by his thank you and the soft closing of the door. This tremendous detail was to be cleared up at last. I told you I went there, said Gatsby. I heard you, but I'd like to know when. It was in 1919. I only stayed 5 months. That's why I can't really call myself an Oxford man. Tom glanced around to see if we mirrored his unbelief, but we were all looking at Gatsby. It was an opportunity they gave to some of us officers after the armistice, he continued. We could go to any of the universities in England or France. I wanted to get up and slap him on the back. I had one of those renewals of complete faith in him that I had experienced before. Daisy rose, smiling faintly, and went to the table. Open the whiskey, Tom, she ordered, and I'll make you a mint julep. Then you won't seem so stupid to yourself. Look at the mint. Wait a minute, snapped Tom. I want to ask Mr. Gatsby one more question. Go on, Gatsby said politely. What kind of row are you trying to cause in my house, anyway? What? Okay, so he's like, why are you having an affair with my wife? What are you trying to do? Let's just get this out in the open. They were out in the open at last, and Gatsby was content. He isn't causing a row. Daisy looked desperately from one to the other. You're causing a row. Please have a little self-control. Self-control? Repeated Tom incredulously. I suppose the latest thing is to sit back and let Mr. Nobody from nowhere make love to your wife? Well, if that's the idea, you can count me out. Nowadays, people begin by sneering at family life and family institutions, and next they'll throw everything overboard and have intermarriage between black and white. Okay, so not only is he extremely racist, but he doesn't feel like the law of marriage. He doesn't feel like rules belong or apply to him. He is saying his family life is falling apart because his wife is having an affair, but he is doing the exact same thing. And because he is so outrageous, because he is so full of himself, because he is so full of hubris, pride, he refuses to acknowledge the guilt that he plays as well. Okay, where was I? Flushed with his impassioned gibberish, he saw himself standing alone on the last barrier of civilization. We're all white here, murmured Jordan. I know I'm not very popular. I don't give big parties. I suppose you've got to make your house into a pigsty in order to have any friends in the modern world. Angry as I was, as we all were, I was tempted to laugh whenever he opened his mouth. The transition from libertine to prig was so complete. I've got something to tell you, old sport, began Gatsby, but Daisy guessed at his intention. Please don't, she interrupted helplessly. Please, let's all go home. Why don't we all go home? Okay, what do you think Gatsby's going to say? He's going to say that Daisy and I are in love, that Daisy's going to leave you. What do you think Daisy's starting to do here? Is she starting to see that what this has been is not really a reality? That's a good idea, I got up. Come on, Tom. Nobody wants a drink. I want to know what Mr. Gatsby has to tell me. Your wife doesn't love you, said Gatsby. She never loved you. She loves me. You must be crazy, explained Tom automatically. Gatsby sprang to his feet, vivid with excitement. She never loved you, do you hear? He cried. She only married you because I was poor, and she was tired of waiting for me. It was a terrible mistake, but in her heart she never loved anyone except me. At this point, Jordan and I tried to go, but Tom and Gatsby insisted with competitive firmness that we remain, as though neither of them had anything to conceal, and it would be a privilege to partake vicariously of their emotions. Sit down, Daisy! Tom's voice groped unsuccessfully for the paternal note. What's been going on? I want to hear about it. I told you what's been going on, said Gatsby. Going on for 5 years, and you didn't know. Tom turned to Daisy sharply. You've been seeing this fellow for 5 years? Not seeing, said Gatsby. No, we couldn't meet. But both of us loved each other all the time, old sport, and you didn't know. I used to laugh sometimes, but there was no laughter in his eyes. To think that you didn't know. Oh, that's all. Tom tapped his thick fingers together like a clergyman and leaned back in his chair. You're crazy, he exploded. I can't speak about what happened 5 years ago, because I didn't know Daisy then, and I'll be damned if I see how you got within a mile of her unless you brought the groceries to the back door. But all the rest of that's the goddamned lie. Daisy loved me when she marries me, and she loves me now. No, said Gatsby, shaking his head. She does, though. The trouble is that sometimes she gets foolish ideas in her head and doesn't know what she's doing, he nodded sagely. And what's more, I love Daisy, too. Once in a while I go off on a spree and make a fool of myself, but I always come back, and in my heart I love her all the time. You're revolting, said Daisy. She turned to me and her voice dropped an octave lower, filled the room with thrilling scorn. Do you know why we left Chicago? I'm surprised that didn't treat you to the story of that little spree. Okay, so Daisy's like, you're revolting. You've had so many affairs. That's the reason why we had to leave Chicago. Gatsby walked over and stood beside her. Daisy, that's all over now, he said earnestly. It doesn't matter anymore. Just tell him the truth that you never loved him, and it's all wiped out forever. Okay, so Gatsby's like, if you just tell him that you don't love him, it'll all go away, and we can relive the past, and we can start the past over today. She looked at him blindly. Why, how could I love him possibly? You never loved him. She hesitated. Okay. Is Daisy really going to go through with this? Her eyes fell on Jordan and me with a sort of appeal, as though she realized at last what she was doing, and as though she had never all along intended doing anything at all. But it was done now. It was too late. Okay, so we all know that Daisy would probably just pretend to continue to have this affair, and one day it would just kind of eventually fade away. She never planned on ever leaving Tom. I never loved him, she said with perceptible reluctance. Not at Calipini, demanded Tom suddenly. No. From the ballroom beneath, muffled and suffocating chords were drifting up on hot waves of air. Not the day I carried you down from the punch bowl to keep your shoes dry? There was a husky tenderness in his tone. Daisy? Please don't. Her voice was cold, but the rancor was gone from it. She looked at Gatsby. There, Jay, she said, but her hand, as she tried to light a cigarette, was trembling. Suddenly she threw the cigarette and the burning match on the carpet. Oh, you want too much, she cried at Gatsby. I love you now. Isn't that enough? I can't help what's past. She began to sob helplessly. I did love him once, but I loved you too. Gatsby's eyes opened and closed. You loved me too? He repeated. Even that's a lie, said Tom savagely. She didn't know you were alive. Why, there's things between Daisy and me that you'll never know, things that neither of us can ever forget. The words seemed to bite physically into Gatsby. I want to speak to Daisy alone, he insisted. That's all. She's all excited now. Even alone, I can't say I never loved Tom, she admitted in a pitiful voice. It wouldn't be true. Okay, so Gatsby, in his past mind cannot fathom that she's lived a life for 5 years. And yeah, she did love Tom, and she still does love Tom. And Gatsby is just beside himself because of this. Of course it wouldn't, agreed Tom. She turned to her husband. As if it mattered to you, she said. Of course it mattered. I'm going to take better care of you from now on. Okay, so they're kind of making up. You don't understand, said Gatsby with a touch of panic. You're not going to take care of her anymore. I'm not? Tom opened his eyes wide and laughed. He could afford to control himself now. Why's that? Daisy's leaving you. Okay, Tom's won. Nonsense. I am, though, she said with a visible effort. She's not leaving me. Tom's words suddenly leaned down over Gatsby. Certainly not for some common swindler who'd have to steal the ring to put on her finger. Ooh, he just called him out. And he's like, I know what you do is illegal. I know you're a bootlegger. I won't stand this, cried Daisy. Oh, please, let's get out. Who are you, anyhow? Broke out Tom. You're one of the bunch that hangs around Mayor Wolsham. That much I happen to know. I've made a little investigation into your affairs, and I'll carry it further tomorrow. You can suit yourself about that, old sport, said Gatsby steadily. I found out what your drugstores were. He turned to us and spoke rapidly. He and Wolsham bought up a lot of side street drugstores here in Chicago and sold grain alcohol over the counter. That's one of his little stunts. I picked him for a bootlegger the first time I saw him, and I wasn't far wrong. What about it? Said Gatsby politely. I guess your friend Walter Chase wasn't too proud to come in on it. And you left him in the lurch, didn't you? You let him go to jail for a month over in New Jersey. God, you ought to hear Walter on the subject of you. He came to us dead broke. He was very glad to pick up some money, old sport. Don't call me old sport, cried Tom. Gatsby said nothing. Walter could have you up on the betting laws, too, but Wolsham scared him into shutting his mouth. That unfamiliar yet recognizable look was back in Gatsby's face. That store business was just small change, continued Tom slowly. But you've got something on now that Walter's afraid to tell me about. I glanced at Daisy, who was staring terrified between Gatsby and her husband, and at Jordan, who began to balance an invisible but absorbing object on the tip of her chin. Then I turned back to Gatsby and was startled at his expression. He looked, and this is said in all contempt for the babbled slander of his garden, as if he had killed a man. For a moment, the set on his face could be described in just that fantastic way. Okay, so Gatsby looks terrified. Gatsby looks like he's killed someone. Gatsby, his secrets are out there on the table. It passed, and he began to talk excitedly to Daisy, denying everything, defending his name against accusations that had not been made. But with every word she was drawing further and further into herself. So she gave that up, and the only dead dream fought on this afternoon slipped away, trying to touch what was no longer tangible, struggling unhappily, undespairingly toward that lost voice across the room. The voice begged again to go. Please, Tom, I can't stand this anymore. Okay, Tom's come up on top. The more Daisy learns about who Gatsby really is, the more she goes into herself, and the more we'll find her nearing Tom. Her frightened eyes told that whatever intentions, whatever courage she had had, were definitely gone. Okay, so it's done did over with Gatsby. You two start on home, Daisy, said Tom, in Mr. Gatsby's car. She looked at Tom, alarmed now, but he insisted with magnanimous scorn. Okay, so Tom is confident. He's won. He has nothing left to prove. He is so confident that he's like, you know what, Daisy, you and Gatsby drive back together. You can chat it out. And Daisy's like, what? He goes, no, you two can drive home together. Okay? So remember, Daisy, okay, and Gatsby are driving in Tom's coupe. Got it? Go on. He won't annoy you. I think he realizes that his presumptuous little flirtation is over. Oh, Tom just owned Gatsby. He won't annoy you anymore. This flirtation's over. They were gone, without a word snapped out, made accidental, isolated like ghosts, even from our pity. After a moment, Tom got up and began wrapping the unopened bottle of whiskey in a towel. Want any of this stuff, Jordan, Nick? I didn't answer. Nick, he asked. What? Want any? No. I just remembered that today is my birthday. I was 30. Before me stretched the pretentious, menacing road of a new decade. It was 7 o'clock. Okay, pay attention here. It was 7 o'clock when we got into the coupe with him and started for Long Island. Tom talked incessantly, exulting and laughing, but his voice was as remote from Jordan. I am so sorry. Gatsby and Daisy got back into Gatsby's yellow car. Okay? Again, Gatsby and Daisy got back into Gatsby's yellow car. Okay? Tom talked incessantly, exulting and laughing, but his voice was as remote from Jordan and me as the foreign clamor of the sidewalk or the tumult of the elevated overheard. Human sympathy has its limits, and we were content to let all their tragic arguments fade with the city lights behind. 30. The promise of a decade of loneliness. A thinning list of single men to know, a thinning briefcase of enthusiasm, thinning hair. But there was Jordan beside me, who, unlike Daisy, was too wise ever to carry well-forgotten dreams from age to age. As we passed over the dark bridge, her wan face fell lazily against my coat shoulder, and the formidable stroke of 30 died away with the reassuring presence of her hand. So we drove on toward death through the cooling twilight. Okay, so Nick's like, well, what grade do I have at 30? Thinning hair, fewer available women, and, now he said, well, hey, I have Jordan beside me, so I don't really need to worry about much. The young Greek who ran the coffee joint beside the ash heaps was the principal witness at the inquest. Okay, so something just happened. He had slept through the heat until after 5, when he strolled over to the garage and found George Wilson sick in his office. Really sick. Pale as his own pale hair and shaking all over. Michaelis advised him to go to bed, but Wilson refused, saying that he missed a lot of the business if he did. While his neighbor was trying to persuade him, a violent racket broke overhead. I got my wife locked up in there, explained Wilson calmly. She's going to stay there till the day after tomorrow, and then we're going to move away. Michaelis was astonished that they had been neighbors for 4 years, and Wilson had never seemed faintly capable of such a statement. Generally, he was one of those worn-out men who when he wasn't working, he sat on a chair in the doorway and stared at the people and cars that passed along the road. When anyone spoke to him, he invariably laughed in his agreeable, colorless way. He was his wife's man, and not his own. So naturally, Michaelis tried to find out what had happened, but Wilson wouldn't say a word. Instead, he began to throw curious, suspicious glances at his visitor and ask him what he'd been doing at certain times on certain days. Just as the latter was getting uneasy, some workman came past the door, bound for his restaurant, and Michaelis took the opportunity to get away, intending to come back later. But he didn't. He supposed he forgot to, that's all. When he came outside again, a little after 7, he was reminded of the conversation because he heard Mrs. Wilson's voice loud and scolding down the stairs in the garage. "Beat me!" he heard her cry. "Throw me down and beat me, you dirty little coward!" A moment later, she rushed out into the dusk, waving her hands and shouting. Before he could move from his door, the business was over. The death car, as the newspapers called it, didn't stop. It came out of the gathering darkness, wavered tragically for a moment, and then disappeared around the next bend. Michaelis wasn't sure of the color. He told the first policeman that it was light green. The other car, the one going toward New York, came to rest 100 yards beyond it. Its driver hurried back to where Myrtle Wilson, her life violently extinguished, knelt in the road and mingled her thick, dark blood with the dust. Okay, so after the argument that Myrtle and her husband had, she ran out in the middle of the road waving her hands, and she was hit by a car and was killed. Michaelis, this man reached her first, but when they had torn open her shirtwaist, still damp with perspiration, they saw that her left breast was swinging loose like a flap, and there was no need to listen for the heart beneath. The mouth was wide open and ripped at the corners, as though she had choked a little in giving up some tremendous vitality she had stored so long. We saw the 3 or 4 automobiles in a crowd when we were still some distance away. "Wreck," said Tom. "That's good. Wilson will have a little business at last." He slowed down, but still without any intention of stopping, until as we came nearer, the hushed, intent faces on the people at the garage door made him automatically put on the brakes. "We'll take a look," he said doubtfully. "Just a look." I became aware of the hollow wailing sound which issued incessantly from the garage, a sound which, as we got out of the coupe and walked toward the door, resolved itself in the words, "Oh my God," uttered over and over in a gasping moan. "There's some bad trouble here," said Tom excitedly. He reached up on tiptoes and peered over a circle of heads into the garage, which was lit only by a yellow light in a swinging wire basket overhead. Then he made a harsh sound in his throat, and with a violent thrusting movement of his powerful arms, pushed his way through. The circle closed up again with a running murmur of exultation. It was a minute before I could see anything at all. Then new arrivals deranged the line, and Jordan and I were pushed suddenly inside. Myrtle Wilson's body wrapped in a blanket, and then in another blanket, as though she suffered from a chill in the hot night, lay on a work table by the wall, and Tom, with his back to us, was bending over it, motionless. Next to him stood a motorcycle policeman, taking down names of much sweat and correction in a little book. At first I could not find the source of the high groaning words that echoed clamorously throughout the bare garage. Then I saw Wilson, standing on a raised threshold of his office, swaying back and forth and holding to the doorpost with both hands. Some man was talking to him in a low voice and attempting from time to time to lay a hand on his shoulder, but Wilson neither heard nor saw. His eyes would drop slowly from the swinging light to the laden table by the wall, and then jerk back to the light again, and he gave out incessantly his high, horrible call. "Oh, my God! Oh, my God! Oh, my God! Oh, my God!" Presently Tom lifted his head with a jerk, and after staring around the garage with glazed eyes, addressed a muffled, incoherent remark to the policeman. "Maverick!" The policeman was saying. "Oh, nor corrected the man. Maverick! Listen to me," muttered Tom fiercely. Said the He looked up at Tom's broad face, fell sharply on his shoulder. "What do you want, fellow?" "What happened? That's what I want to know." "Otto hit her. Instantly killed." "Instantly killed?" repeated Tom, staring. "She ran in the road. Son of a bitch didn't even stop the car." There was 2 cars. One coming, one going, see?" "Going where?" asked the policeman keenly. "One going each way. Well, his hand rose toward the blankets, but stopped halfway and fell to his side. "She ran out there, and the one coming from New York knocked right in her, going 30 or 40 miles an hour." "What's the name of this place here?" demanded the officer. "Hasn't got a name." A pale, well-dressed Negro stepped near. "It was a yellow car," he said. "A big yellow car. New." "Okay. Whose car hit Myrtle? Who drives a big yellow car?" "Gatsby." Remember, Gatsby and Daisy left together in Gatsby's car to come home. "See the accident?" asked the policeman. "No, but the car passed me down the road going faster than 40, going 50, 60. "Come here and let's have your name. Look out now. I want to get his name." Some words of this conversation must have reached Wilson, swaying in the office door, for suddenly a new theme found voice among his gasping cries. "You don't have to tell me what kind of car it was. I know what kind of car it was." Watching Tom, I saw the wad of muscle back of his shoulder tighten under his coat. He walked quickly over to Wilson and, standing in front of him, seized him firmly by the upper arms. Okay, so Wilson's like, "Oh, I know that car." And Tom's kind of like, "Oh, man, I know what's happening. I've got to shut him down." Okay. "You've got to pull yourself together," he said with soothing gruffness. Wilson's eyes fell upon Tom. He stared up on his tiptoes, and then would have collapsed to his knees had Tom not held him upright. "Listen," said Tom, shaking him a little. "I just got here a minute ago from New York. I was bringing you that coupe you've been talking about. That yellow car I was driving this afternoon wasn't mine, do you hear? I haven't seen it all afternoon." Only the Negro and I were near enough to hear what he said, but the policeman caught something in the tone and looked over with truculent eyes. "What's all this about?" he demanded. "I'm a friend of his." Tom turned his head, but kept his hands firm on Wilson's body. "He says he knows the car that did it. It was a yellow car." Some dim impulse moved the policeman to look suspiciously at Tom. "And what color's your car?" "It's a blue car. A coupe." "We've come straight from New York," I said. Someone who had been driving a little behind us confirmed this, and the policeman turned away. "Now, if you'll let me have the name again, correct?" Picking up Wilson like a doll, Tom carried him to the office, set him in a chair, and came back. "If somebody will come here and sit with him," he snapped authoritatively. He watched while the two men standing closest glanced at each other and went unwillingly into the room. Then Tom shut the door on them and came down the single step, his eyes avoiding the table. As he passed close to me, he whispered, "Let's get out." Self-consciously, with his authoritative arms breaking the way, we pushed through the still-gathering crowd, passing a hurried doctor, case in hand, who had been sent for a wild hope half an hour ago. Tom drove slowly until we were beyond the bend. Then his foot came down hard, and the coupe raced along through the night. In a little while I heard a low, husky sob, and saw that the tears were overflowing down his face. Okay, so Tom does have some kind of humanity towards him. He is clearly visibly upset about the loss of Myrtle. "Goddamn coward," he whispered. "He didn't even stop his car." Okay. Tom assumes that Gatsby was driving and didn't stop. The Buchanan's house floated suddenly toward us through the dark, rustling trees. Tom stopped beside the porch and looked up at the second floor, where two windows bloomed with light among the vines. "Daisy's home," he said. And we got out of the car. He glanced at me and frowned slightly. "I ought to have dropped you in West Egg, Nick. There's nothing we can do tonight." A change had come over him, and he spoke gravely and with decision. As we walked across the moonlight gravel to the porch, he disposed of the situation in a few brisk phrases. "I'll telephone for a taxi to take you home, and while you're waiting, you and Jordan better go in the kitchen and have them get you some supper if you want any." He opened the door. "Come in." "No, thanks. But I'd be glad if you'd order me a taxi. I'll wait outside." Jordan put her hand on my arm. "Won't you come in, Nick?" "No, thanks." I was feeling a little sick and I wanted to be alone, but Jordan lingered for a moment more. "It's only 9:30, she said. "Okay, really, Jordan? It's 9:30. We can still have some fun. Okay, Myrtle Wilson just died, and granted, I know you don't know her, Jordan, but you just witnessed a horrific accident, and then you witnessed everything that just went down to the Plaza Hotel, and you're still wanting to hang out and have something and have a drink, go do something?" I'd be damned if I'd go in. I'd had enough of all of them for one day, and suddenly that included Jordan too. She must have seen something of this in my expression, for she turned abruptly away and ran up the porch steps into the house. I sat down for a few moments with my head in my hands until I heard the phone taken up inside and the butler's voice calling a taxi. Then I walked slowly down the drive away from the house, intending to wait by the gate. I hadn't gone 20 yards when I heard my name, and Gatsby stepped from between the two bushes into the path. I must have felt pretty weird, but by that time, because I could think of nothing except the luminosity of his pink suit under the moon. "What are you doing?" I inquired. "Just standing here, old sport." Somehow that seemed a despicable occupation. For all I knew, he was going to rob the house in a moment. I wouldn't have been surprised to see any sinister faces, the faces of Wolfsham's people behind him in the dark shrubbery. "Did you see any trouble on the road?" he asked after a minute. "Yes." He hesitated. "Was she killed?" "Yes." "I thought so. I told Daisy I thought so. It's better that the shock should all come at once. She stood it pretty well." He spoke as if Daisy's reaction was the only thing that mattered, because that's all that matters to Gatsby. "I got to West Egg by a side road," he went on, "and left the car in my garage. I don't think anybody saw us, but of course I can't be sure. I disliked him so much by this time that I didn't find it necessary to tell him he was wrong." "Who was the woman?" he inquired. "Her name was Wilson. Her husband owns the garage." "How the devil did it happen?" "Well, I tried to swing the wheel," he broke off. And suddenly I guessed at the truth. "Was Daisy driving?" "Yes," he said after a moment. "But of course I'll say I was. So even now that Daisy is back with Tom, he is still willing to take the blame for her. You see, when we left New York, she was very nervous, and she thought it would steady her to drive. And this woman rushed out at us just as we were passing a car coming the other way. It all happened in a minute, but it seemed to me that she wanted to speak to us, though we were somebody she knew. Okay, guys? Remember that afternoon, Tom and Jordan and Nick were all in the yellow car. Okay, remember Tom drove Gatsby's car and Gatsby drove Tom's car. So Myrtle, when she was looking down from the top of the shop, she saw Gatsby's yellow car with Tom Buchanan driving it. So she thought it was Tom, and she thought Tom would slow down. That's why she ran out in the middle of the road to try to get his attention. But it wasn't Tom who was driving. It was Daisy who was driving Gatsby's car. And Daisy doesn't know who Myrtle Wilson is, and nor does Gatsby. Well, first Daisy turned away from the woman toward the other car, and then she lost her nerve and turned back. The second my hand reached the wheel, I felt the shock. It must have killed her instantly. It ripped her open. Don't tell me that old sport, he winced. Anyhow, Daisy stepped on it. I tried to make her stop, but she couldn't, so I pulled on the emergency brake. Then she fell over into my lap, and I drove on. She'll be all right tomorrow, he said presently. I'm just going to wait here and see if he tries to bother her about the unpleasantness this afternoon. She locked herself into her room, and if he tries any brutality, she's going to turn the light out and on again. He won't touch her, I said. He's not thinking about her. Okay, so who was Tom thinking about? He's thinking about Myrtle. I don't trust him, old sport. How long are you going to wait? All night, if necessary. Anyhow, till they all go to bed. A new point of view occurred to me. Suppose Tom found out that Daisy had been driving. He might think he saw a connection in it. He might think anything. I looked at the house. There were 2 or 3 bright windows downstairs, and the pink glow from Daisy's room on the second floor. You wait here, I said. I'll see if there's any sign of a commotion. I walked back along the border of the lawn, traversed the gravel softly, and tiptoed up the veranda steps. The drawing-room curtains were open, and I saw the room was empty. Crossing the porch where we had dined that June night 3 months before, I came to the small rectangle of light, which I guessed was the pantry window. The blind was drawn, but I found a rift at the sill. Daisy and Tom were sitting opposite each other at the kitchen table, with a plate of cold fried chicken between them and 2 bottles of ale. He was talking intently across the table at her, and in his earnestness his hand had fallen upon and covered her own. Once in a while she looked up at him and nodded in agreement. They weren't happy, and neither of them had touched the chicken or the ale, and yet they weren't unhappy either. They're reconciling, guys. There was an unmistakable air of natural intimacy about the picture, and anybody would have said that they were conspiring together. As I tiptoed from the porch, I heard my taxi feeling its way along the dark road toward the house. Gatsby was waiting where I left him in the drive. Is it all quiet up there? He asked anxiously. Yes, it's all quiet, I hesitated. You'd better come home and get some sleep. He shook his head. I want to wait here till Daisy goes to bed. Good night, old sport. He put his hand on his coat pockets and turned back eagerly to his scrutiny of the house, as though my presence marred the sacredness of the vigil. So I walked away and left him standing there in the moonlight, watching over nothing. Okay, so Gatsby still cannot let go of that dream, and that is just what it is. It is a dream. He thought he could recreate the past, and we know that's not happening. We know that Daisy and Tom are reconciling, and we know that Daisy and Tom would never leave each other because they know things about each other. They have that deep-rooted distinction. They have that deep-rooted connection that only comes from being from that old money.